What if the land you once called home, the place where you planted dreams and built a future, was suddenly claimed by strangers while you were left with nothing but the clothes on your back? And what if, after losing everything, you found yourself standing in a courtroom, accused of trespassing on property that was legally, rightfully yours? Would anyone believe you? Would you have the strength to fight? Daniel Cooper, a homeless veteran burdened by loss and betrayal, dares to challenge a powerful corporation in a battle for justice, dignity, and the truth. As secrets unravel and loyalties are tested, could one man's courage rewrite a fate seemingly carved in stone? Before we continue this story, let us know where you are watching from. If you like stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another special story for you. Daniel Cooper still. D at the defendant's table, shoulders weighed down by a tattered army jacket and boots scuffed from years on the streets. The courtroom was deathly silent, as though everyone had collectively held their breath. He was a homeless veteran, accused of trespassing on private property. The prosecutor laid out the charges with confidence, but Daniel remained unnervingly calm. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, he nodded and cleared his throat. "I know why I'm here," Daniel began, voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. "But before anyone decides my fate, there's something you should all know. The land I'm accused of trespassing on, well, it belongs to me." A sudden wave of astonished whispers broke the stillness. The judge rapped his gavel to restore order. Every face in the courtroom turned toward Daniel, trying to parse how a man who appeared to have lost everything could possibly own a piece of property valuable enough to land him in trouble. "Are you suggesting you have legal claim over the land in question?" the judge asked, leaning forward. "Do you possess any proof?" Lowering his gaze, Daniel gripped the edge of the table. "I can explain everything, Your Honor," he said quietly. "But it's a long story." Intrigued, despite himself, the judge allowed Daniel to proceed. The prosecutor shot Daniel a skeptical glance, and a faint smirk tugged at the corner of their mouth. Yet the spectators leaned in, eager to hear what the homeless veteran had to say. Daniel began by talking about simpler days. He grew up in a small Indiana town, son of hardworking farmers who had little in the way of money, but plenty in the way of love. When he turned 18, he enlisted in the military, driven by equal parts patriotism and a desire to make his family proud. Years in uniform hardened him and exposed him to life's harsh truths, but when he returned home, he was determined to forge a meaningful life. With the money he'd saved, Daniel started a small carpentry business. His rough, calloused hands took pride in shaping wood into graceful, sturdy furniture. His enterprise turned enough profit that he managed to purchase a modest piece of land on the outskirts of town. The plan was to build on it, something simple, a place he could genuinely call his own. Then the 2008 economic crash derailed his dream. Business dried up, loans were called in, and Daniel's once promising venture crumbled beneath the weight of mounting debts. Eventually, he found himself living out of his truck, then on the streets, drifting from shelter to shelter. He kept a photograph of his parents and a worn Bible, two keepsakes he cherished. During those desperate years, he discovered just how invisible people like him could become. Applications went unanswered, calls led nowhere. The land he owned receded into a distant memory, overshadowed by the daily struggle to find work, safety, and a hot meal. Yet Daniel never entirely gave up hope. He believed in resilience, in the possibility that each dawn might bring better luck. One day, while roaming for a place to sleep, he recognized a stretch of road near his old property. On a whim, he ventured out to see what had become of the land he had purchased. It was unrecognizable. A towering fence had been erected, and construction crews were hard at work building the foundations of something grand, a development far beyond anything he'd planned. Without fully thinking it through, Daniel hopped the fence at night. Spotting a massive oak tree he used to rest under, he felt an ache in his chest. He simply wanted to be there one more time, to remember what had once been his. A security guard discovered him and called the police. Now he stood accused of trespassing. "That's my land," Daniel concluded quietly. I may not have the paperwork in my pocket, but I promise you, it was never sold. At least, not legally. The judge regarded him with a thoughtful expression. Compelling story, Mr. Cooper. But the court requires evidence. Daniel nodded, determination flickering in his eyes. I know, Your Honor. I have it. Or at least I know how to find it. When the judge announced a short recess, the courtroom buzzed with questions. Had Daniel simply made this up to avoid jail? Or could he really prove that a homeless veteran owned property with enough value to attract developers? Outside, Daniel took a seat on a battered wooden bench, staring at his calloused palms. He just opened a door that might be near impossible to close. The stakes, his freedom, his dignity, and this mysterious land had never felt higher. The following day, the courtroom was packed with curious onlookers. Journalists, drawn by Daniel's shocking claim, jostled for space to cover the unfolding drama. Veterans advocacy groups sent representatives, hopeful that Daniel's story might shed light on a broader issue of homeless veterans losing track of their assets. Somewhere in the crowd was Henry, an old friend Daniel had known years ago. But whether Henry was even still around, Daniel didn't know. The judge resumed the hearing, eyebrows raised in mild curiosity. Mr. Cooper, he began, you indicated you'd provide evidence. Where is it? Slowly, Daniel approached with a worn leather folder in hand. Inside was a faded deed, dotted with coffee stains and lacking an official county seal. It's the only record I've got, Daniel admitted, but the original papers should be on file with the county. The prosecutors sprang up from their seat with an incredulous laugh. Your Honor, this is nonsense. Anyone can produce a slip of paper. Without official stamps or county seals, this so-called deed is meaningless. Daniel refused to wilt under the scornful tone. I bought that land before everything fell apart. I tried to pay taxes, but when I lost my house and moved around, the paperwork never caught up. When I finally returned, some developer was there, acting like they owned the place. No one would believe me, said I was just some vagrant. The judge examined the battered folder, brow furrowed. It's incomplete, he muttered, clearly torn. Is there anyone who can corroborate Mr. Cooper's claim? Daniel clenched his jaw and confessed that he needed time to track someone down, a friend named Henry Walker. The judge, intrigued by Daniel's determination, granted him 1 week to find evidence and witnesses. The prosecutor scoffed, but couldn't sway the judge's decision. After leaving the courthouse, Daniel found himself retracing old routes in search of Henry. Memories of nights spent at homeless shelters and in soup kitchen lines surfaced, each tinged with the weight of the years. Back when they last spoke, Henry had been job hunting after the financial crash. Daniel suspected he might have left town long ago, maybe heading west for ranch work. But he wouldn't quit. The man was his only shot at corroborating the original purchase. Late one evening, while Daniel was resting on a cold bench in a public park, a familiar voice cut through the darkness. Done? That really you? He looked up and saw Henry, older and more worn, but still sporting that signature half-grin. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then, relief washed over them both. Daniel quickly explained his legal troubles, the lost deed, and the impending court date. Henry's expression went grave. I remember you buying that land, Henry said, shaking his head in disbelief. I helped you plant those first few trees, helped you build the foundation for that old cabin. Of course I'll testify. Daniel's shoulders relaxed for the first time in days. But Henry's face held caution. There's something you gotta hear, Dan. You're not the only one claiming rights to that property. Rumor is it went up for auction after you supposedly disappeared, and a big shot developer bought it. That's not possible, Daniel exclaimed, anger pricking at him. I never authorized any sale, never saw a single notice. I was just homeless. Henry sighed. I know, but banks and counties, they don't always bother chasing you down. If they see you haven't paid property taxes, they treat it like you're a ghost. Anyone with money can swoop in. That might be what happened. Daniel's face hardened. I'm not letting them get away with it. They spent the next day scouring local archives and city records, finding only hints of an auction. The documentation was either missing or so haphazardly filed that it raised suspicions. The county offices claimed Daniel's property had been legally repossessed, but the timelines looked off. Frustrated, Daniel asked, "How do I prove the auction was illegal?" Henry paused, rubbing his temples. "I know a guy, Joe. He used to do investigative work. If anyone can trace a paper trail, it's him. We might be able to show the auction was rigged." The plan gave Daniel hope, but he also felt the weight of the ticking clock. The judge had given them 1 week. Joe turned out to be a no-nonsense man in his 50s, with salt and pepper stubble and the calm air of someone who'd seen it all. As soon as Henry introduced Daniel, Joe started peppering him with questions about dates, receipts, and any existing communication with the county. "People like that developer typically have their bases covered," Joe said solemnly. "But if they cut corners, I'll find it." Daniel offered a tight smile. "Thank you. At this point, any help is a lifeline." They agreed to meet in a few days, giving Joe time to comb through official records. Daniel, though buoyed by Henry's testimony and Joe's expertise, still felt a coil of dread. Whoever had claimed his property wasn't just going to give it up. And if those people had the power to manipulate an auction, what else might they be willing to do? Daniel arrived at Joe's makeshift office, a cramped, cluttered space lined with filing cabinets and old newspapers, feeling equal parts anxious and hopeful. Joe beckoned him in, tapping on a computer keyboard. "I've dug up some interesting stuff," he said, never taking his eyes off the screen. "Seems the land was auctioned off suspiciously fast, well before the legal grace period for delinquent taxes was up." Henry leaned in, eyes wide. "That means the sale might be illegal, right?" Joe shrugged, scrolling through more files. "A lot depends on how brazen they were. It's one thing to fast-track an auction for a few weeks early, but I'm seeing a pattern of them listing properties as abandoned without proper procedure. If I can get my hands on the records, we might have a real case." Daniel exhaled, relief briefly flooding through him. So there's hope. The flicker of optimism was short-lived. Later that night, Daniel spotted a black SUV parked across the street from the homeless shelter where he was staying. Its engine idled, the driver barely visible behind tinted windows. Something about it fell off, like the vehicle didn't belong. After a few minutes, it drove away. By the next morning, it was back. Henry took one look and muttered, "We're being watched." Joe nodded grimly when Daniel told him. They probably got wind of the investigation. Corporations like this don't appreciate prying eyes. Still, they pressed on. A major break came when Joe discovered that the developer was Harland and Company, a corporation notorious for purchasing land at rock-bottom prices. Rumor had it they played dirty, exploiting legal loopholes and sometimes forging documents to expedite sales. After cross-referencing multiple auctions, Joe found a worrying thread. Harland and Company's name appeared again and again. Properties seized under questionable circumstances ended up in their portfolio. "These guys are pros," Joe said, raking a hand through his hair. "They've got money, lawyers, and local officials in their pocket. Exposing them won't be simple." Daniel clenched his jaw. "I don't care. We gotta try." Joe recommended they get legal help. Someone who could actually stand up to Harland and Company in court. Enter Elizabeth Hayes, a sharp-witted attorney who specialized in property disputes. She had a reputation for taking on big corporations. When Daniel explained his story, Elizabeth's eyes narrowed with a mix of empathy and determination. "You have a compelling case," she said, "but it hinges on proving that auction never should have happened. We need to demonstrate that you were actively trying to maintain ownership, even if you were homeless." She wasted no time filing a motion to halt further development on Daniel's land until the court could review all documentation. That same day, Elizabeth also reached out to the media, recognizing the power of public opinion. Outlets started running headlines like "Homeless Veteran Claims Land Stolen by Major Developer," a narrative that caught fire quickly. Support flooded in from veterans groups who recognized that this wasn't an isolated tale. Many homeless veterans had lost property due to bureaucratic tangles. Donations trickled into a small fund Elizabeth set up to cover Daniel's legal fees. It wasn't enough to match a corporate giant, but every little bit helped. Meanwhile, tensions escalated. The black SUV sightings became more frequent, and on a particularly tense evening, two men confronted Daniel and Henry in a deserted parking lot. They wore expensive suits and had the cold detachment of hired muscle. "Mr. Cooper," one drawled, "Harland and Company has a generous settlement in mind, if you agree to drop your claims." Daniel's anger flared. "Not a chance. That land was mine." The man's lips curled into a humorless smile. "Suing us won't end well for you. You have no idea how deep our resources go." Henry stepped forward, fist-balled, but Daniel stopped him. "We're done here," Daniel said, turning his back. The men let him walk away, though their threat hung in the air like a storm cloud. Days later, another blow struck. The homeless shelter where Daniel slept was set ablaze in the middle of the night. By luck, no one was killed, but the courtyard was badly damaged. Standing in the smoky aftermath, Daniel's heart pounded with both relief and dread. "Anyone get hurt?" he asked the shelter's director, Margie, who shook her head, tears in her eyes. "But we lost supplies, and we'll need to close for repairs." "This is devastating." She and Daniel both knew it was no coincidence. "I think it's connected to me," he admitted quietly. "I'm so sorry." Margie placed a trembling hand on his shoulder. "We'll survive. Just make sure you do too." Elizabeth insisted on reporting the suspected arson to the authorities, linking it to Daniel's legal battle. Meanwhile, Joe dug deeper, suspecting Harland and Company might be behind the intimidation tactics, but proving it wouldn't be easy. "They're pushing you to fold," Elizabeth told Daniel. "Or worse, they're trying to force you into a mistake that discredits you in court." Daniel's resolve only hardened. "I won't be bullied. That land is all I've got left." She gave him a look of quiet admiration. "You've got more than that, Daniel. You've got people who believe in you." Encouraged by the show of solidarity from Henry, Joe, and now entire groups of supporters, Daniel pressed onward. He would face the next court date armed with new findings, ready to confront Harland and Company head-on, no matter how hard they tried to silence him. The day finally arrived for Daniel's case to be heard in earnest. The courtroom brimmed with people, supporters, media, curious locals. Harland and Company's legal team, a phalanx of well-dressed attorneys, filed in with a cold confidence. Across the aisle, Daniel took his seat beside Elizabeth and Henry. Joe sat just behind, ready to provide evidence. The tension was palpable. Once proceedings began, Elizabeth presented the incomplete deed and a host of supplementary documents Joe had tracked down, including property tax letters Daniel had tried to send when he was still living in his truck. Mr. Cooper never intended to abandon his property, Elizabeth argued, pointing to the letters. He made repeated attempts to rectify his tax situation, but the system failed him. Harland and Company's lead counsel, a tall woman with an icy stare, rose to counter. "These documents amount to hearsay at best. Mr. Cooper did not pay taxes for multiple years, and by county statute, the land was deemed abandoned. We secured it through a lawful auction." Elizabeth's lip curled. "Lawful? We have evidence showing the auction's timeline was illegally shortened. And here's something else. Your own surveys indicating the presence of valuable mineral deposits. It seems quite convenient that you rushed to seize abandoned land that turned out to be worth millions." A hushed uproar spread through the courtroom. The judge called for order. Elizabeth then introduced the star piece of evidence Joe had uncovered, a geological report confirming rare earth minerals beneath Daniel's plot. Harland and Company's counsel tried to object, but the judge allowed it. Murmurs rippled as the significance of that revelation sank in. Suddenly, the courtroom doors swung open. A woman in a sharp navy suit stepped inside, commanding immediate attention. She introduced herself as Natalie Kane, a former employee of Harland and Company's legal department. "Your Honor," Natalie said, voice steady, "I have documents proving Harland and Company falsified auction records, bribed local officials, and systematically targeted properties owned by vulnerable individuals, like Mr. Cooper." The prosecutor's face blanched. Gasps erupted among the spectators. Natalie handed a flash drive to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. These files contain internal emails, memos, and contracts. They outline exactly how the company manipulated land auctions to exploit owners. Harland and Company's counsel sprang up, demanding the judge disallow the files on grounds of unethical acquisition of internal corporate data. But the judge was in no mood to indulge. Given the gravity of these allegations, the court will review the evidence, he declared. Continue, Ms. Kane. Natalie recounted how she'd grown increasingly uncomfortable witnessing the company's tactics. They had hired private investigators to dig up dirt on property owners, used forged signatures, and even orchestrated the kind of intimidation Daniel had been facing. They wanted Mr. Cooper's land specifically because it was rumored to contain a rich mineral vein. Once they confirmed that with their own geological survey, they rushed the auction through with no notice to him. The gallery buzzed, everyone riveted by Natalie's testimony. Harland and Company's counsel tried to poke holes in her credibility, branding her a disgruntled ex-employee. But Natalie stood firm, shoulders squared. I may be disgruntled, but I'm not a liar, she retorted, gesturing toward the files. Everything is in there, black and white. Elizabeth approached, clarifying how these newly discovered documents dovetailed perfectly with Joe's investigation. Harland and Company claimed the land was lawfully won, yet they obstructed Mr. Cooper's attempts to pay taxes, manipulated official records, and forcibly evicted him under the guise of trespassing. That's not a lawful transaction, it's theft. By now, the courtroom felt like a pressure cooker. The judge motioned for a brief recess to review the evidence personally. During the break, Daniel and Natalie exchanged a quiet word in the hallway. She admitted she'd been afraid, even going into hiding at one point. I'm sorry I disappeared, she said softly, but I had to come back. I couldn't let them keep doing this. Daniel thanked her, gratitude shining in his eyes. You're risking a lot, telling the truth like this. I won't forget it. When the judge reconvened, his expression was grim. The content of these files is deeply concerning, he said. If even half of it proves accurate, Harland and Company orchestrated an illegal seizure of Mr. Cooper's land. I'm placing an immediate injunction on all development at the property while we conduct a full investigation. Cheers and applause broke out from Daniel's supporters. The attorneys for Harland and Company paled, hastily conferring among themselves. The judge rapped his gavel for silence, then continued. This court is also recommending a federal inquiry into Harland and Company's conduct. Should these allegations hold, criminal charges may follow. Leaving the courthouse, Daniel found himself surrounded by well-wishers and reporters. Cameras flashed, microphones appeared, but he hardly registered any of it. Henry, Elizabeth, Joe, and Natalie gathered around him. They had won a crucial battle, but they all sensed the war wasn't done. Daniel's land might be returned, but Harland and Company, with bottomless resources, would not go quietly. Later that evening, the group convened at a modest diner to debrief. Elizabeth was cautious. We still have to secure a final ruling transferring ownership back to you. If Harland and Company push their countersuits and continue with intimidation, this won't be easy. Natalie, sipping her coffee, nodded. They have deep pockets, but we've struck a serious blow today. The court is on alert, and the public is watching. Henry flashed a grin. They try to run us off the road, burn down a shelter, and threaten Daniel more times than I can count. They can't hide anymore. Despite the flicker of triumph, Daniel sensed a looming shadow. He toppled a giant, but the giant wasn't yet defeated. In his gut, he knew Harland and Company would use every trick in the book to maintain their grip on that mineral-rich land. As he walked out into the cool night, Daniel stared at the stars, remembering the lonely nights he'd slept beneath them. Tonight, he was no longer alone, and that gave him strength to keep fighting until justice was fully served. Over the next several weeks, the investigation into Harland and Company unfolded at a dizzying pace. Federal agents descended on the corporation's offices, confiscating computers and boxes of paperwork. Anonymous whistleblowers emerged, further damning the company with stories of underhanded deals and hush-money payoffs. Public opinion turned sharply against Harland and Company. Meanwhile, Daniel's case continued in court. Elizabeth persisted in demanding that full ownership be returned to Daniel immediately, citing the mounting evidence of fraud. Harland and Company's counsel fought fiercely, launching countersuits accusing Daniel of defamation and even conspiracy. They tried to bury him in paperwork, hoping to force him into a settlement. But after years of scraping by on the streets, Daniel Cooper was not a man to fold under pressure. "I've got nothing left to lose," he told Elizabeth one night, scanning the latest pile of legal motions in Joe's office. "I'm not taking a dime from them unless they give me back my land." Henry nodded, clapping Daniel on the shoulder. "That's right. We're in this till the end." Despite the support and the promising turn of events, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling he was still being watched. The same black SUV occasionally showed up, idling near the diner or outside the temporary shelter where he now stayed. One evening, its driver rolled down the window, revealing a stern-faced man who simply glared at Daniel in silence before peeling away. It was intimidation, pure and simple, but Daniel refused to be rattled. Natalie, continuing her role as a whistleblower, testified in a federal hearing that Harland and Company systematically acquired undervalued land by lobbying county officials to expedite auctions. She revealed internal emails where executives discussed removing homeless individuals from the equation. The phrase made the judge's face go pale. Outside the hearing, supporters rallied, holding signs that read "Justice for Daniel" and "Stop exploiting the homeless." Then came the day of reckoning. The court convened to deliver its final judgment on Daniel's rightful claim. The gallery was once again standing room only. Harland and Company's legal team sat rigid, exuding an aura of desperation concealed behind expensive suits. Across the aisle, Daniel clutched a photograph of his parents, people who had once owned nothing more than a humble farm, yet had given him all the love in the world. Elizabeth made her closing argument, voice resonating in the hushed room. Harland and Company manipulated the system to rob a vulnerable veteran of his property. They ignored legal requirements, forged documents, and resorted to intimidation and violence. Mr. Cooper may be homeless, but he's not without rights. The judge, an older gentleman with silver hair and an air of gravitas, cleared his throat. "The evidence is overwhelming. It shows that Harland and Company engaged in unethical and likely illegal practices to obtain Mr. Cooper's land. Consequently, the auction is void, and the property will revert to Mr. Cooper immediately. Furthermore, this court is notifying federal authorities to pursue criminal charges against relevant parties within Harland and Company." A roar of applause erupted, and the judge banged his gavel to silence the room. Daniel felt his legs go weak. Henry steadied him as tears blurred his vision. It was done. He had his land back. Reporters flooded him with questions outside the courthouse. Elizabeth stood to one side, managing the media frenzy, while Joe wore a triumphant grin. Natalie quietly slipped away, wary of cameras. But Daniel made sure to catch up to her before she could vanish. "I owe you so much," he said, voice rough. She shook her head. "You don't owe me. I just did what had to be done." In the following weeks, the federal investigation into Harland and Company snowballed. Executives were arrested, and the corporation declared bankruptcy. It was as if a dam had broken, and waves of testimony and lawsuits flooded the system. For many, Daniel's case became a beacon, evidence that justice could prevail against all odds. Back on his land, Daniel walked among the debris of half-finished construction. Bent rebar stuck out from cement blocks that once formed the skeleton of luxury homes. He paused at the ancient oak tree, running a hand over its rough bark. It felt like greeting an old friend. Henry joined him, squinting in the afternoon light. "What now? Gonna build your house?" Daniel exhaled, gazing across the plot of earth that held both painful memories and unimaginable value. "I want to make it a place that helps people, veterans, and the homeless. I can't just cash in on the minerals." There's more at stake than money. Henry chuckled, a note of pride in his voice. You've got a good heart, Dan. They began to organize plans for a small community center, a transitional shelter for veterans who found themselves where Daniel once was, cold, alone, and ignored. Word spread, and volunteers arrived. Some hauled away construction rubble. Others donated supplies. Elizabeth and Joe helped navigate the legal complexities, ensuring Daniel retained full control of the property's future. On a crisp morning months later, Daniel stood at the crest of his land, watching volunteers erect a sturdy building frame. Laughter and conversation floated up from below, blending with the sound of hammers and saws. He took a moment to reflect on how far he'd come, from a lonely defendant in a courtroom to the rightful steward of a sanctuary in the making. The scars remained, nights spent hungry under overpasses, the fire at the shelter, the menacing black SUV. But in the end, Daniel refused to be defined by those chapters. He had found allies in unlikely places, discovered his own unbreakable resolve, and reclaimed more than just dirt and trees. He had reclaimed his sense of worth. A breeze rippled through the oak's leaves, as if whispering approval. Daniel closed his eyes, letting gratitude fill his lungs. The fight had been long and brutal, but he had emerged victorious, not just for himself, but for countless others who never even knew how close they were to losing everything. Tomorrow promised new hurdles, but for now, he allowed himself to breathe in the peace he had so dearly earned. Daniel Cooper's journey began in a silent courtroom, where a single statement shook everyone present, that he was not trespassing, but rather returning to land he rightfully owned. What followed was an epic clash between a homeless veteran and a powerful corporation, each determined to stake their claim on an unassuming plot of earth that concealed immense wealth. Along the way, Daniel forged alliances with individuals who believed in justice. Henry, Joe, Elizabeth, and Natalie, each playing a vital role in exposing Harland and Company's corruption. More than just a legal victory, Daniel's triumph became a symbol of resilience and hope. His battle illuminated how easily those living on society's margins can lose the few assets they possess, while shining a light on the capacity for solidarity and courage. The outpouring of public support underscored a truth often overlooked, that ordinary people, united by empathy and principle, can stand against even the most formidable of adversaries. When Daniel finally stood on his reclaimed land, he did so not merely as an individual, but as a testament to the power of perseverance. He resolved to transform that property into a refuge for veterans and the homeless, ensuring that others would not face the same hardships he endured. His story, once rooted in tragedy and desperation, had evolved into a narrative of rebirth and community. In the end, it was not about the minerals hidden beneath the soil, but about defending one's dignity and offering a haven to those who needed it most. And as the sun set behind the old oak tree on Daniel's land, it illuminated a simple, irrefutable truth. When people stand together for what is right, even the greatest obstacles can be overcome.